Hi, this is Kevin at the Virtual Planetarium at Raritan Valley Community College. Welcome to our weekly Star Talk. Today we're going to be talking about hurricanes and storms. But before we do that, let's talk about our upcoming moon phases. We have a new moon on September 6th, we have a first quarter moon on September 13th, and then we have a full moon on September 20th. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about storms. But actually, before we talk about that, let's talk about something else first. Because this weekend is Labor Day weekend, and for a lot of people that means it's the end of summer. Mostly because that's when the classes start and summer vacation ends, sadly. But, just in case you didn't know, this isn't actually the official end of summer. The summer season goes on for a few more weeks until September 22nd. This September 22nd date is known as the fall equinox, and we'll talk about what that means as the date gets closer because it's actually a really special day in the year. So we'll talk about that in a few weeks. Okay, but today we're going to be talking about hurricanes and storms. Why? Well, Ida just came by and dumped a lot of water on us, and it is hurricane season, so it's as good a time as any, I guess, to talk about hurricanes and storms. But there's also a planet in the sky that has its own storms. But we're going to get to that in a bit. First, let's talk about what does hurricane season mean. Hurricane season is a time of the year when we normally expect to see more hurricanes and tropical storms. It goes on from about June through the end of November, but it usually peaks between August and October. And you might be wondering, why is this time of year when more hurricanes form? And well, it's because the conditions are more ideal. The oceans are warmer, and also the wind, moisture, and wave conditions are ideal. What does that mean? Well, to understand that, we have to know how a hurricane forms. A hurricane forms when the warm, moist air that's just over the ocean rises because warm air rises, and then as that warm, moist air rises, it's replaced by cold air. But since the oceans are warm, that air also gets warmed up eventually, and then that goes back up and then gets replaced by more cold air. So when the conditions are ideal, this process keeps repeating until we get a low pressure point. And eventually this low pressure point, because of all that turning, is going to turn into a low pressure rotating storm, which brings with it a lot of rain, a lot of wind, and thunderstorms. Hurricanes can be really dangerous because of all this rain and wind. Even the hurricane remnants can be dangerous, as we saw from all the rain that Ida dropped. Ida was a hurricane that formed in the Gulf of Mexico, and then the storm went up through New Orleans and dumped a lot of rain and damage there. And usually when hurricanes come over land, they weaken and then stop being a hurricane and lose their form and everything. But even though it weakened and stopped being a hurricane, all that cloud, all that moisture came up to us and dumped a lot of rain on us and actually caused a lot of damage and flooding. So again, even the remnants can be very dangerous. Now, how do we keep track of hurricanes? How do we know when they're coming, when they're forming, and where they're forming? Well, back in the olden days, when we didn't have satellites and when we didn't have a lot of space exploration experience, people would actually have to fly out over the ocean and see if the storms were forming. But thankfully, we have advancements in technology and in space, so we actually have a bunch of satellites out in space monitoring the Earth. And a lot of these are normal weather satellites that we use to see how the weather patterns are moving along. And most of them are run by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA for short. They actually have an array of stationary satellites that they use to keep an eye on the whole, our whole half of the Earth. They also have a really cool website, this one right here, where you can access the different views of the different satellites. For example, we could see a full disk view of what the satellites are seeing. And we can see this animation loop, so we can keep an eye of everything that's happening on our half of the globe. I'm going to put the link for this website in the description so you guys can check it out as well. We can look at the northeast region right here, where we are here in New Jersey. And again, we can see the different color bands of things that are happening over us. This is visible light, so here we can see just the clouds that are over us right now. So it's really, really cool. Now, you should never use just this website to determine how dangerous a storm could be. You should listen to your local authorities. You can listen to the local weather channels or anything, but they can tell you what you really need to know. The National Hurricane Center also has its own website. I'm going to put this in the description as well, where you can track the storms and where they're projected to go. Right now we have Hurricane Larry in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and if we click on that, we can tell that it doesn't really look like it's going anywhere, which is good for us, but it gives you the forecast and the predictions. But again, even this isn't updated real time, so you should always listen to your local weather stations or local authorities for what to do if a storm is coming your way. Because we all want to stay safe, but it is still cool to see these storms from outer space, so it's really cool to be able to actually see what satellites are also seeing from outer space. Like I mentioned earlier, there's actually storms on other planets. One of the planets, and probably the one with the most famous storms, is a planet that we've mentioned earlier and a few times in this series actually, and that's the planet Jupiter. Jupiter, once again, is really, really bright in the nighttime sky. You can see it just after sunset, even before it gets completely dark. But if you do go outside when it is completely dark, it is up in the sky all night, and it is really, really bright. We finally had a clear night last night, and I was blown away by how bright it was. So you should look towards the south, and when you find that really bright spot, that is the planet Jupiter. Now, like I said, Jupiter probably has the most famous storm in the solar system. It has this very big storm that's called the Great Red Spot. Here we have a picture of Jupiter taken by a very nice satellite, and we can see a bunch of cloud bands on it. These are different colored clouds on Jupiter, but on this lower, darker band, we see this giant red spot right here. A really cool thing about the storm is that it's very famous in history. Astronomers have actually been observing the storm for almost 400 years. And while it is getting a little smaller, it used to be able to fit about 4 Earths, but now it can only fit about 1. It is still very visible and very evident. If you have even a decent sized telescope and you can see the cloud bands on Jupiter, if the storm is facing us, you might also be able to see that as well, which is pretty cool. Now, one thing about the storm is that we've always called it a hurricane because it's easier, but it's actually the opposite of a hurricane. Like I said, hurricanes are low pressure systems, but this one right here is a high pressure system, and it's called an anticyclonic storm, which is pretty cool. So instead of having a lot of low pressure in there, which brings all the clouds and rain into that part, it has a high pressure system, which is something that we also see sometimes here on Earth, but it's a lot more rare. Now, that isn't the only storm on Jupiter. Jupiter is actually riddled with storms. If you look at a close-up of Jupiter, like a bunch of the pictures that the mission Juno is sending back to us right now, you see a bunch of swirls on the planet. These swirls are actually all storms, which is incredible. It has so many storms. Now, we think Jupiter has so many storms because, well, first of all, it's a gas giant, so it's all atmosphere, so that's a lot of wind to swirl around, a lot of gas to swirl around. But also, Jupiter is rotating really, really fast, and so all that rotating so fast generates a lot of energy, and we think that's what can cause so many storms to form on this planet. But regardless, as beautiful as it looks, as cool as it seems, it doesn't really seem like a very fun place to live in. But at least it's cool to see through a telescope, so that's fun. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you learned something new. You should definitely check out those 2 websites. Again, you should never use them solely as a measure for how dangerous the storm is going to be. You should always listen to local authorities, and if they tell you to evacuate, you should evacuate. But it's still really cool to be able to see how the storms look from outer space with the different satellites that we have. If you like this video, be sure to give us a like down below, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel. We're going to be putting out a new video every week. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a great week.